Sunday afternoon, nice Sunday afternoon. And everybody knows who I am, so I'm going to introduce myself. And, but I'm going to introduce my friend Bachman. Bachman Aziz, who will introduce our speaker, Stephan Gowans. Bachman is a leader of the U.S. Peace Council, which is a member group of UNAC. And he's also the representative of the World Peace Council. He's their NGO representative at the United Nations. And Bachman and me and a couple of others formed together the Hands Off Syria Coalition, which has invited Stephan to be here today. And so I'm going to let Bachman introduce Stephan, and then he'll speak, and then we'll get some questions and discussion.
Thank you, Joe. Well, I just want to briefly talk about what we are doing with regard to the coalition. This is actually the third round of speaking tours that we have organized. The first one was after U.S. Peace Council sent a delegation to Syria last year, 2016. And the first round rounds of speaking was the report back by our delegation to Syria, during which they met with all kinds of groupings and people from civil society, the students, faculty, labor unions, different groups in society, also the opposition parties, and with government officials, and also with President Assad himself for 2 hours. And when they came back, of course, we were attacked in every possible way about the trip. But that was okay because they gave us opportunity to clarify some of the lies that have been going on about Syria and the reason for the war and everything else. So that first tour with delegates from different organizations, Veterans for Peace, from the UNAC, from Peace Council, and some independent people, faculty members and all that. They spread out. Some of them were on the West Coast. They spoke on the West Coast, and some of them on the East Coast spoke here. And on the East Coast, there were cities, and we started the campaign. You know, once that happened in the Peace Council, and together with Joe, we realized that we have to pull our forces together to really respond to this anti-Syrian war campaign that we have. So we created a Hands Off Syria coalition, and we came up with a statement of unity which has been signed, as most of you probably know, by more than about 300 organizations around the world, and 500 leaders of the peace movement around the world again, many national organizations and parties from everywhere, and close to 1,700, 1,600 individuals, activists from all over the world, and it was very well received in terms of the position we took. And the fundamental to our position was that the war is continuing because of U.S. foreign policy, and U.S. involvement in the Middle East, and that this should end. The U.S. has no right to be in Syria, and that the question was because as soon as our delegation returned, we were accused of being, the term they used was, you drank Assad's Kool-Aid. So our position in the coalition is that it's not up to us to decide whether Assad should go or stay. According to the UN Charter, it's up to the people of the country to decide. We are in no position from here to say whether we want Assad to go or whether we want him to stay. It's not our business. So what we are fighting against in the coalition is against the interventionist policy, against international law that is going on. Not only in Syria, but it happened in Iraq, it happened in Libya, it happened in many other countries. In Yemen, we are doing it, we are agitating in Venezuela, everywhere. This is going on. There are some strategic reasons that the United States is involved, and that is, those strategic reasons are not the interests of American people. It is for the interests of big business and big corporations and oil companies, weapons manufacturers, and employees. So this is our campaign, and the second round we brought, I'm sure you're aware of it, Ivo Bartlett, independent Canadian journalist, who had spent time in Aleppo during the heat of the war there in Aleppo. And she came back and we invited her to come here, and she did a 10-city tour, I guess it was 10, in the United States, and another 4 or 5 city tour in Canada, right? It was very successful. We got a lot of coverage. We had press conferences at the United Nations and all that, and it really was well received internationally. So this is our third round. Steve published this book, The Long War, Washington's Long War on Syria. We thought, okay, this is another possibility for us to bring the issue of Syria to the people, to the public, and expose the lies that are going on. Many people don't know the history, the background, when the whole thing started, what is the project, what's the purpose, and all those things. And I think personally, and many of us think that Steve's book really sheds a bright light on what has been going on in Syria and what are the objectives and everything else. So we're happy to have Steve here. Unfortunately, we couldn't have him for longer time to start the 10-city war, 10-city speech for him, but at least we had to live with 3 cities on the East Coast, and because of his job, and that could be away from his job. So I'm happy to introduce my dear friend Stephan Gowans, and I've been familiar with his work for many, many years through his writings on the internet, and also he has a blog called What's Left, which I encourage you to take a look at. And he has a lot of other writings. It's not just Syria that he's working on, it's much broader about U.S. foreign policy, Western policies, and all those things. So I encourage you to take a look at his blog also. Steve, thank you very much. It's an honor to have you here.
Thank you, Bob. So I was told that one speaking event that I should stand because it raises the energy level in the room. I'm not sure I can do that. My energy level is low. So I'll sit.
This is your energy level. This is your energy level like this.
Yeah. Also, no problems reading, but I have my notes here. So I'll talk about my book, but I'm going to begin by talking about someone else's book. And this is a way of prefacing the comments I'm going to make. So I'm going to talk about someone, just to start, named Graham E. Fuller. I don't know if any of you have heard of Graham E. Fuller. He had a 27-year career in the U.S. foreign policy establishment. At various times he was CIA station chief in Kabul. He was the senior political scientist at the RAND Corporation. And he was vice chair of the National Intelligence Council, which is the body responsible for producing the National Intelligence Estimate, which you may have heard is used to determine if does Iran have nuclear weapons, et cetera, et cetera. So he had a very elevated career within the U.S. foreign policy establishment. Today he teaches history in Canada. Maybe that's significant that he's in Canada and not the United States. But he wrote a book, he's written a number of books, one of which is very interesting. Well, all of his books are interesting, but one I want to refer to is called The World Without Islam. And that title was ambiguously chosen. So when you say world without Islam, it sounds like it's appealing to people who say, I hate Muslims and I wish there were no Muslims in the world. That's not what the book's about. He didn't choose the title, his publisher chose it. What he's doing is he's doing a thought experiment. He's asking, what would happen if there was no Islam? Would the relationship between the West, led by the United States, and the Arab and Muslim worlds be any different? And his answer is no. It would be exactly the same. And it would be exactly the same because he argues that the conflict between the West and the Arab and Muslim worlds originates not in the clash of civilizations, but owing to the oppression of the Arab and Muslim worlds by the West. So his argument is it's U.S. foreign policy that accounts for the conflict. It has nothing to do with his land. So let me just quote some of the things that Fuller wrote. The United States today is, by its own reckoning, the overwhelmingly dominant power in the world in nearly all spheres, with the determination to impose its will on the rest of the world by one means or another. If you ever read the 2015 National Security Strategy document, I don't know if you've read that, it's readily available. It's a really astonishing document. It's about national security, so you'd think it would be about the military, but if you read it, you'll notice that almost all of it is about economics. Almost all of it is about the economic systems or system that Washington wishes the rest of the world would adopt. Of course, most of the world is within this U.S. superintended economic system, but not all of the world is. But in that document, Washington speaks quite unapologetically about being able to lead the world, and certainly intending to lead the world. And so, I mean, that's simply reflected as well in Fuller's comments, that the United States has every intention of imposing its will on the rest of the world. So he goes on and he says that imperialism, uses the word imperialism, cannot be far off the mark. Even after the formal age of Western imperialism, new forms of imperialism were introduced in the modern era, especially in the Middle East, starting with the rulers selected by the British to dominate, and then he puts this in quotation marks, the independent governments of most states. These rulers are expected to be responsive to Western needs and preferences, even in the absence of support from their own people. And then he continues, the majority of the leaders in the Arab world and elsewhere supported in power by the West and pursue pro-Western policies that are unpopular with their local populations. So those are the views of someone who had very senior positions within the U.S. foreign policy establishment. By the way, my publisher says, you know, no mainstream publisher would ever touch your book. And yet, I'm reading Fuller, and he was published by a mainstream publisher. And one of the things he says is about 9/11, if you can imagine this. He says, it's never a question of whether 9/11 was going to happen. It's a question of why it didn't happen much sooner. So I thought that Fuller can get published by a mainstream publisher saying things like that. I'm not sure why I can't get published saying things that are perhaps less provocative than that. That would seem to be provocative to a U.S. audience. So anyway, so if Fuller says the majority of leaders in the Arab world are supported and empowered by the West and pursue pro-Western policies that are unpopular with the local population, that must mean that there's a minority of leaders in the Arab world that are not supported and empowered by the West, who we can infer are not supported and empowered in the West because they don't, or they fail to support pro-Western policy. So which leaders make up this minority? And one way to figure that out is to consider where the U.S. military footprint is absent in the world, or in the Arab and Muslim worlds. In the Arab and Muslim worlds have recently been U.S. military installations in Turkey, in Israel, Jordan, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Yemen, Bahrain, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, Oman, Afghanistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Pakistan, Algeria, Tunisia, Egypt. You want me to stop at any point? Djibouti, Philippines. So what Arab and Muslim countries are missing from the list? I mean, conspicuously missing are the Islamic Republic of Iran, Iraq under Saddam, Libya under Gaddafi, and Syria under the Assads. So if you think about this, there were no U.S. military bases in Saddam's Iraq or Gaddafi's Libya, not because the United States didn't want to establish military bases in those countries, but because Saddam and Gaddafi refused to allow them to be established. Neither leader was willing to permit his country to be integrated into the United States informal, undeclared empire. You must have an empire when you have military bases scattered around the world. There are no U.S. military bases in Iran. In fact, the Iranian constitution forbids the establishment of foreign military installations on Iranian soil. And there are no U.S. military installations in Syria except for the ones that are there now illegally established by U.S. forces in contravention of U.S. or international law. And just parenthetically, there are 70,000 U.S. troops in Europe scattered throughout the continent on bases, many of which have tactical nuclear weapons. And you can ask why. I mean, World War II has been over for a long time. If we want to talk about the Cold War, that presumably has ended as well. But in this, there's an extraordinary interview that was conducted by United Press International in 2002 with former U.S. Secretary of State Al Haig, who had been the supreme commander of NATO forces in Europe. And so he was asked, why are there 70,000 troops, U.S. troops in Europe? And his answer was, quote, we have those troops in Europe, quote, because it keeps European markets open to us. If those troops weren't there, those markets would probably be more difficult to access. So, I mean, significantly, he had acknowledged that a core function of the U.S. military is to safeguard the interests of corporate America. So is this an outlandish idea? To some people, it's an outlandish idea, but there was one U.S. Marine Corps general who at the time of his death was the most highly decorated Marine in history. He declared in the 1935 confession that he spent 33 years of military service as, quote, a high-class muscle man for big business for Wall Street and the banks. But more recently, that's a long time ago, so people can say, oh yeah, that was in 1935. But former U.S. Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, the National Security Advisor, just recently has released her memoirs. And she was being interviewed on National Public Radio. And she said, U.S. foreign policy is not guided by goals of human rights promotion or promoting democracy. She said, quote, for every president, for every Secretary of State, American national security and American economic interests, that is the primary goal. So my argument, made in the book, is that the markets and the labor and the resources of Iraq under Saddam were not fully open in an unimpeded manner to the United States. And the resources and the labor of Libya under Gaddafi were not fully open to the United States. And I'll talk more about that later. Also, the policies of the Islamic Republic of Iran today and of Syria today are impediments to U.S. investment and trade. And so my argument is that the hostility of Washington to Saddam's Iraq, to Gaddafi's Libya, to the Islamic Republic of Iran, and what I'm going to call Arab nationalist Syria, is ultimately traceable to the U.S. project of exploiting the Arab and Muslim worlds economically and the resistance of these states to that project. By the way, the UPI interview with Haig from 2002 appeared under an interesting headline. The headline was, Haig, Syria should be the next target. That was in 2002. And I mentioned that to remind you that Washington's long war on Syria began well before 2011, when Obama declared that Assad must step down. It began, as you'll see, actually earlier than 2002, when Haig said that Syria should be the next target. So let me turn from Fuller to Washington's long war on Syria. And let me begin by saying that while my book is titled Washington's Long War on Syria, that the war on Syria is more multiform than the title suggests. And it's not only a war between Washington and its allies on one hand and Damascus and its allies on the other. It's also a civil war that's been going on since the late 1940s between Islamists on the one hand and secularists on the other. And these two groups have very different and ultimately irreconcilable views about how to organize Syrian society. So the two major antagonists in this long-running civil war are the secular Ba'ath Arab Socialist Party, whose partisans came to power in a military coup in 1963. The current president is a member of the Ba'ath Arab Socialist Party. The other antagonist is the Muslim Brotherhood, so Syria's premier organization of Sunni political Islam, and that's the ideological antecedent of Al-Qaeda and ISIS, but Al-Qaeda and ISIS have been influenced by other forms of political Islam as well. But the Muslim Brothers have made significant contributions to the thought of Al-Qaeda and ISIS. In fact, most of the leaders of Al-Qaeda were members of the Muslim Brotherhood. So what I'll do here is I'll step you through an historical timeline of this long conflict that's going on in Syria, with its elements of civil war and interventionist war. By the way, I'm just thinking about this here, you should extend some sympathy to Bauman, who's had to sit through this for 2 days. And this is the third
I'm
part.
enjoying it.
Memorizing.
So in the mid-50s, Washington and London had conspired to purge 3 men in Damascus who were in the leadership of the Syrian government. There was 2 Arab nationalists and a communist that they regarded as particularly dangerous, and they were particularly dangerous from the perspective of Washington and London because they're seen as threatening Western economic interests in the Middle East. So something had to be done about them. And the CIA called on one of its main operatives, Kermit Roosevelt, who was from the Roosevelt family, which gave your country Theodore and Franklin Delano. But Kermit has become infamous in history because he had engineered the overthrow of Iran's prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, who had committed the grave crime against Western domination of nationalizing his country's oil industry. So Kermit was pressed into service again. So he and British intelligence planned to enlist the help of the Muslim Brothers in Syria to overthrow the 3 men in Damascus who they saw as threatening Western economic interests. So they essentially do in Damascus what they'd done in Iran. That didn't happen. That plot didn't come off for various reasons, but the intention was to deal with people who appeared to be threats to Western economic interests by affecting a regime change. In the 1960s, the Muslim Brothers in Syria led all kinds of protests and strikes and demonstrations and riots under the banner of Islam or Ba'ath Arab socialism, or Islam or secularism. And this is always in opposition to what they called the government's godless character. The government was depicted as an infidel government, enemies of Allah. In 1967, the Brotherhood declared a holy war against the Ba'ath Arab socialists and denounced them as infidels and enemies of God who needed to be eliminated. Well, then in the 1970s, the Brotherhood established an underground paramilitary organization. And this anticipated the rebels of today. So we all hear about the rebels. Well, in the 1970s, there were rebels. And these rebels were trained and armed outside of Syria. Well, today, rebels are trained and armed outside of Syria as well, in Jordan and Qatar, with money provided by the United States, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Jordan, and Turkey. So the brothers, back in the 70s, launched a major campaign of urban guerrilla warfare. They assassinated Ba'ath Arab socialists, they murdered state officials, they killed army officers, they attacked government buildings, they assaulted Syrian military installations. It was an insurgency, a guerrilla war. Strangely, many people don't know about that. There's been a guerrilla war, there have been guerrilla wars in Syria that resemble the guerrilla war and insurgency that's going on today. It's often thought that all of this conflict started in 2011 and that history began in 2011 in Syria. Well, it's more a matter of history repeating itself. Well, in 1973, the Ba'ath Arab Socialist president of the country, his name was Hafez al-Assad, it's the father of the current president, Bashar al-Assad. He oversaw the drafting of a constitution for Syria. And the constitution said the Syrian state is going to have a mission. It has a mission in the world. And the mission is to bring the Arab world together, to overcome its religious differences and its sectarian differences and all of its differences which they consider to be insignificant, and to achieve the Arab world's liberation from foreign domination. There was an Arab nationalist who asked this question: how is it that in 1948, in the so-called Arab-Israeli war, how is it that the Zionist forces were able to prevail over 5 Arab armies? 5 Arab armies failed to defeat the Israelis, the Zionists. His answer was, why did they fail? Because there were 5 Arab armies. And that is the idea behind Arab nationalism, to bring the Arab world together, to overcome its multiple divisions. And that was one of the things that Assad set as a task for his country. He was also going to modernize and indigenize the economy of Syria. And that was going to be accomplished through public ownership and planning of the economy, or what Washington and others would call socialism. So there's already a black mark against his name. He's a socialist. And in fact, they didn't call him a socialist, they said he's a communist. In Washington, he was known as an Arab communist. He wasn't a communist, though. He was suspicious of communists, and communists were suspicious of him. But from Washington's point of view, he may as well have been a communist, because the policies he was implementing of economic modernization and indigenization were equal in effect to the kinds of policies authentic communists would implement if they were in power. Because these policies had the effect of limiting the investment opportunities of corporate America, limiting the export opportunity. Well, in 1970, or 1980 rather, there was a CIA officer named Robert Baer who spent decades in the Middle East. And he was in Syria. And he came back and he said that Syria was the epicenter of Islamist terrorism. I mention all of this because we might say it's the epicenter of Islamist terrorism today. Well, it was seen that way back in 1980 as well. So he wrote about his experiences, and he said, when I first set foot in Damascus in 1980, I estimated that Assad had maybe 3 or 4 years before he went under. Well, people were saying that about Assad's son after 2011. In fact, they were saying maybe he has 3 or 4 months before he goes under. Baer said, I asked the Muslim Brothers owned the street, that the mosque schools were teaching jihad. The mosque public address system blared out a message of hate and revenge. I figured this guy's going to get strung up on a light pole in downtown Damascus like a lot of other Syrians, and he was going to get strung up by the Islamists. So in 1980, the brothers, the Muslim Brotherhood, established an Islamic Front for Syria, whose manifesto declared there would be a war without end against Ba'ath Arab socialism until it was exterminated in Syria. And that's the language they used, that's the approach they used. These weren't moderate people who wanted to have a discussion about how we were going to organize society. They were going to exterminate the secularists who were enemies of Allah. So by the way, there are 3 things that the Muslim Brothers and other Sunni sectarian political Islamists hate about Ba'ath Arab socialism. What they hate are the ideological foundations of the Ba'ath Arab socialist project. And those foundations are nationalism, secularism, and socialism. They hate these things because these ideologies are of European origin. So they're foreign to the Muslim world. They're foreign to the Quran. They don't come from God, they come from man. And therefore, they need to be eliminated. Because the idea of the Islamists is God has imparted view about how to organize society. And because it comes from God, it's the perfect view. It's not the view of flawed mankind. Nationalism, socialism, secularism, these are all human ideas, not divine ideas. And so Ba'ath Arab socialism, in their view, is a godless implantation, European implantation into the Muslim world, which must be exterminated if the Muslim world is going to be dominated by its, or not dominated, liberated from its domination from the West, by the West. So in their view, liberation amounts to re-Islamization, or the project of restoring Islam to its previous primacy in the Arab world, before the encounter with European colonialism, when Islam lost its significance. So if we re-establish Islam as a significant force in our society, we will have become independent of the foreign meddling with which we've had to contend with for all of these years. So the Ba'ath Arab socialists, by contrast, have the same goal of liberating the Arab world from its historical domination by the West, but they propose to do so in very different ways. First, they're going to overcome the Arab world's differences, particularly the sectarian differences that keep them apart. There's a sectarian difference of Shia versus Sunni. And the Muslim Brothers are Sunni, and they tend to be sectarian. The Ba'ath Arab socialists say, let's overcome that religious cleavage. How are we going to unify the Arab world and achieve our liberation if we're divided along religious lines? In fact, religious minorities who've been traditionally persecuted in Syria were drawn to the Ba'ath Arab Socialist Party because it was a party that was going to liberate them from their persecution by overcoming these religious differences. It's a non-sectarian party. And the Ba'ath Arab socialism is guided by three goals. So the three goals are embedded in their motto. So I'll tell you what the motto is, and then I'll give you a sense of what they're trying to accomplish. Their motto is freedom, unity, and socialism. And what that means is freedom from foreign domination, unity of the Arab world, and socialism, which they mean self-directed economic development in order to overcome the underdevelopment of the Arab world that is a legacy of their colonial past. Well, so in 1982, a very significant event happens in Syria, and that is that the Muslim Brothers seize control of Hama, which is the fourth largest city in the country. And they go on a blood-soaked rampage throughout the country. They attack police stations, they murder every Ba'ath Arab socialist they can find. They hunt them down and they kill them because they want to exterminate that ideology. They execute government officials. They kill soldiers. Every Ba'ath Arab Socialist Party official in that city was executed, and many of them by decapitation. So all of the stuff we see about ISIS and decapitation, none of it is new. The Syrian army mobilized to quell the uprising. When they quelled the uprising, what they discovered was that the rebels had 15,000 foreign supplied firearms. They also captured Jordanian and CIA-trained paramilitaries. So likewise, today, insurgents in Syria have been trained by the CIA and other Western intelligence services and bases in Jordan and Qatar. It's like history repeating itself. In the 1990s, the Muslim Brothers established an alliance with other sectarian Sunni political Islamists to form what they called the National Front for the Salvation of Syria. That sounds progressive, the salvation of Syria. But what they're really talking about was the salvation of Syria from nationalism, from secularism, and from socialism. The front had two goals. The first goal, the most pressing goal, was to assassinate Assad. The second goal, the more fundamental long-term goal, was to establish a society based on the Quran. So, let's jump to 2001. In the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, he was retired at the time U.S. Army General Wesley Clark, who led the NATO assault on Yugoslavia in 1999. He told a reporter, Amy Goodman in fact, that during a trip to the Pentagon he'd learned that plans had been drawn up to invade a number of countries. Included Iraq, which was soon after invaded, included Libya, which was attacked, and Syria, among others. So, as early as 2001, there were plans to attack and invade Syria. 2002, Syria was added to the Bush administration's axis of evil, so its regime change hit list. You'll remember that the initial three countries were Iraq, Iran, and North Korea. 2002, three more countries were added: Sudan, Cuba, and Syria. Washington claimed that Syria was developing weapons of mass destruction and supporting terrorism. Now, you've heard that claim before. Who was it made against? The other axis of evil member, Iraq. Significantly, this is not widely known, Iraq was also governed by Ba'ath Arab socialists. Saddam was a Ba'ath Arab socialist. Saddam was guided by the same principles, the same models, the same goals: freedom, socialism, and unity. Yeah. So, I mean, we'll recall that the charge of weapons of mass destruction was the pretext to topple, what turned out to be, to topple the Ba'ath Arab socialist government in Baghdad, and ultimately to privatize the Iraqi economy. The Iraqi economy, which in Washington was denounced as socialist. We didn't hear a lot about that in the media, but if you read some of the government reports, you'll see that Iraq's economy was being denounced as viciously socialist. That was one of the words. I'm not sure what viciously socialist means. Or other things were being said. If you've been in Iraq for the last 10 years, then, I mean, your only view of the economy is one that should be socialistically organized. So, and indeed, Iraq's economy was largely publicly owned and planned. Iraq had combined its oil wealth with public ownership and planning of the economy to produce what one former U.S. State Department official had called the Golden Age. So he wrote, schools, universities, hospitals, factories, theaters, and museums proliferated. Employment became so universal that a labor shortage developed. Or as the veteran foreign affairs correspondent Robert Fisk recently wrote, I don't know if any of you follow Robert Fisk, who writes a lot about the Middle East, about Syria. He writes for The Independent in the UK. He wrote, Saddam used Iraq's oil wealth to cover the country in superhighways, modern technology, state-of-the-art healthcare, hospitals, and modern communications. The same former U.S. State Department official who remarked on Saddam bringing about a golden age in Iraq wrote about Gaddafi, that by combining Libya's oil wealth with public ownership and planning of the economy, that Gaddafi had enabled Libyans to, quote, live beyond the dreams of their fathers and grandfathers. In 1965, the capital of Libya was a shanty town without running water, without electricity. Oil had only been recently discovered, but the proceeds from the oil were monopolized by the king and his retinue, weren't shared out to the desperately poor people of the country. That changed under Gaddafi's rule. And he uplifted people in Libya and immensely changed the material conditions of their lives. So, 2003, following the U.S.-British invasion of Iraq. This is not widely known today, but it's on the public record. You can find this in U.S. government documents, discussion of this. The United States had every intention, or had an intention, a plan to invade Syria following its invasion of Iraq. But it abandoned that plan. And it abandoned that plan because it discovered that its hands were filled with the pacification of Iraq and Afghanistan. It was no longer militarily feasible to carry out the invasion, so it was going to have to achieve its regime change goals for Syria by other means. So what were the other means? The first alternative, there were two things that were done. The first thing that was done was to impose sanctions on Syria. and to do what sanctions are always intended to do. Sometimes people think sanctions, that's a peaceful way of resolving difficulties. Sanctions are intended to destroy economies. And the United States, by imposing sanctions on an economy, because the United States has such an immense economic footprint in the world, can destroy small countries easily, with impunity. And that was the intention here. You destroy an economy, you make the lives of ordinary people so miserable that they rise up against the government. The sanctions, as intended, devastated Syria. This too isn't widely recognized, but in October 2011, the New York Times reported that the Syrian economy, quote, was buckling under the pressure of sanctions by the West. By the spring of 2012. So, I mean, this is an instance of foreign policy working very well. You impose sanctions with the intention of destroying an economy, that's what you're doing. By the end of 2012, sanctions-induced financial hemorrhaging had, quote, according to the New York Times, forced Syrian officials to stop providing education, healthcare, and other essential services in some parts of the country. In 2016, according to a leaked UN internal report, US and EU economic sanctions on Syria were, quote, causing huge suffering among ordinary Syrians and preventing the delivery of humanitarian aid. So you want to create chaos, you want to create misery and suffering in a country, impose sanctions. The veteran foreign affairs correspondent, Patrick Coburn, likened the sanctions imposed on Syria to sanctions that had been imposed on Iraq from the early 1990s to 2003. Those sanctions, according to a UN estimate, had led to the deaths of over 500,000 Iraqi children due to malnutrition and disease. That has produced more deaths than had been produced by all the weapons of mass destruction in history. And that led two political scientists, John and Carl Mueller, to describe the sanctions as sanctions of mass destruction. In case we ever think about sanctions as a peaceful way of resolving difficulties. And these sanctions of mass destruction are more devastating than the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, more devastating than all the mustard gas used in the First World War. Now, largely unrecognized is that sanctions of this caliber have been destroying Syria for the past 14 years. So, you know, we see the attacks carried out by Washington's proxy guerrilla armies. We see the decapitations and the eviscerations and the barbecuing of heads and guerrillas eating human hearts. And we see the suicide bombs. But what we don't see, and we don't recognize this, is the equally, in fact, the more devastating effects of sanctions of mass destruction. Now, significantly, the moment that the sanctions were lifted on this defeated Arab nationalist Iraq in 2003, they were immediately imposed on an unbowed Arab nationalist Syria. So sanctions come off Iraq, they're immediately placed on Syria. Which means that from the early 1990s to 2017, for the past quarter century, the United States and its allies have waged a highly destructive campaign of economic warfare. The equivalent of a nuclear attack. You know, first on Iraq, subsequently on Syria. And it's instructive to ask why. Why is this being done? It's being done because the United States and its allies are opposed to the Ba'ath Arab socialist efforts to bring the economies and the politics of the Arab world under the control of the people who live and work in the Arab world, who ought to have control of their economies and politics. And we complain about Russians interfering in the democracy of the United States, and yet this is a massive interference in the economies and democracy or politics of the Arab world. To the extent of killing, I mean, hundreds of thousands of people through sanctions, as I said, in effect producing a nuclear attack, or the equivalent of a nuclear attack. So if this constitution, or rather the sanctions constituted the first means by which to bring about a regime change in the absence of an invasion which couldn't be carried out. The second was to reignite the Islamist war on the Syrian state. And that Islamist war had largely petered out after the Syrian, or the Muslim Brothers had taken control of Hama and then had been put down by the Syrian Arab army. And now there was a program to reignite this war. So in 2006, Syria's Muslim Brotherhood had at least 2 meetings in the White House. Now, how do I know that? I don't know for sure, but that's what the Wall Street Journal told me. In 2007, the Muslim Brotherhood, also according to the Wall Street Journal, helped found the National Salvation Front. The National Salvation Front met frequently, according to the Wall Street Journal, with the U.S. State Department and with the U.S. National Security Council, as well as with the U.S. government-funded Middle East Partnership Initiative. In late 2010, December 2010, this is just months before riots would erupt in Syria, in this town of Dara. And that would mark the beginning of what became known as the Arab Spring in Syria. So just a few months before that, Muslim Brothers announced publicly that they hope a civil revolt will break out to topple Assad's heretical government. And a few months later, that hope is realized. But then that's an outcome the United States and Muslim Brotherhood had been working towards since 2016. But in early 2011, so January, February, before this uprising in Dara, there is tumult spreading across the Arab world. So in Egypt, we have an uprising, we have demonstrations, mass demonstrations. In Tunisia, we've already had a revolution of sorts. And there's an uprising in Libya, but nothing's happening in Syria. The country is completely quiet. And Western news organizations are scratching their heads. What's going on? We have this Arab Spring, but it's not happening in Syria. So, the New York Times, Time magazine, send their reporters to Syria to find out what's going on. And here's what they reported. They said all was quiet in Syria because the government had broad support. They said all was quiet in Syria because even critics conceded that Assad is popular. They said all was quiet in Syria because Assad had, and this is Time magazine, said, endeared himself to the population, especially to youth, that segment of the population from which a rebellion was expected to spring. They said all was quiet in Syria because attempts to organize protests against the government had failed. Time magazine said they had fizzled. Tried to organize protests and a few people showed up. And those few people chanted slogans against Gaddafi, not against the government. Time and the New York Times concluded that Syrians had felt no compulsion to protest against the government. Time, interestingly, quoted some students who said, why would we protest against the government? They pay our way to university, our tuition's paid, they pay for our books, they give us this, they give us that. We have no problems with the government. And you can confirm all of this yourself. I mean, you don't have to believe me. Just go to the Internet archives of the New York Times and Time magazine. It's really easy to do. And then just look for articles written about Syria in February, March, and April of 2011. I did that because I follow news very closely. And people started talking about, there was this secular, pro-democracy, liberal, democratic movement to happen in Syria. There were peaceful protests, and this movement was hijacked by Islamists later on. And I thought, this is funny because I don't remember reading about that, so did I miss something? And that's why I went back to the archives and I started reading through all of the coverage that, the first days of the uprising to find out what was going on. What I found was what was reported was very different from the mythology that subsequently developed. But in mid-March, you can read about this, about a riot that broke out in Dara. Dara is a town of about 90,000. It's situated about 8 miles from the Jordanian border. So this riot, obviously as riots are, was violent. Rioters, or some rioters, carried arms and used them. Buildings were burned. Vehicles were set fire to. The buildings were Syrian government offices. There was 2 cell phone company offices that were burned. And I have to ask people, because they don't often think about this in these terms, but in fact I was speaking to some people yesterday in New Haven who were asking about this, and I asked them, what do you think would happen if there was a riot in New Haven and people were shooting at the police and they were burning the town hall down and attacking commercial buildings and burning vehicles in the street? How would the government react? But that's what happened. And the other people who talked about Dara said that the police were unarmed. And the government didn't want to provoke the demonstrators, so they initially used unarmed police. But anyway, U.S. officials, according to the New York Times, quote, acknowledged that the demonstrations weren't peaceful and that some protesters were armed. So there was this mythology, however, that developed about this, which said that you could read this if you followed the press coverage about this, that the demonstrations were largely peaceful. So they said largely peaceful. What does largely peaceful mean? It means they weren't peaceful. There was some violence. But that sentence was constructed in a way to suggest it was peaceful. Later, the modifier largely was dropped altogether. And so then the story became the demonstrations were peaceful. There were these peaceful demonstrations, and then suddenly this brutal dictator came along and he crushed the peaceful demonstration violently. At the time, however, neither the New York Times or U.S. officials saw the protests as peaceful demonstrations and acknowledged that they were violent. A week after the outbreak of this violence in Dara, Time reported that, quote, there do not appear to be widespread calls for the fall of the regime or the removal of the popular president. That, too, clashes with the narrative. Over a month after the outbreak of the violence, the New York Times reporter, Anthony Shadid, who ended up dying in Syria through actually an anaphylaxis, or an anaphylactic shock, he would report that, quote, the protests fall short of the popular upheaval of revolutions in Egypt and Tunisia. Significantly, Time reported that Islam was playing a prominent role in the protests. If you knew something about the history of conflict between the secularists and the Islamists in Syria, you might have expected that to be the case. So if you look back, you have these civil disturbances fomented by Islamists dating to the 1960s. In 1967, the Muslim Brothers say we're going to launch a holy war against the government. You have the Islamist guerrilla warfare dating to the 1970s, culminating in the violent takeover of Hama in 1982. You have Islamists meeting with the White House, the National Security Council, and the State Department after 2006, when Washington abandons plans for an invasion of Syria. And we also have Islam playing a prominent role in the protests, and the protests are violent and involve arms. Well then, consistent with this, in 2012, the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency, which was the agency at the time led by Trump's first national security advisor, what's his name, Michael Flynn. They write a report, and the report says the insurgency in Syria is led by Islamists. And it also says it's led by which Islamists? Well, that's the question is, so which Islamists? It says it's led by Islamists, and it identifies the Islamists who are leading the insurgency. Based on what I just told you about what's been happening since the 1960s, you could probably guess who they said it was. They said the Muslim Brotherhood, as well as Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which became ISIS. So, you have this indication after indication that the uprising was not a peaceful movement for a liberal democracy, but a renewal of Syria's decades-long civil war between Islamists and secularists. It was egged on by, facilitated by, financed by the United States and its allies. And all of this was done because the United States needed a proxy to carry out a war, because it couldn't intervene directly owing to its entanglements in Afghanistan and Iraq. In fact, the Defense Intelligence Agency report said the insurgents were supported by the United States and by its allies in the Middle East and by Turkey. So, there are all kinds of other reasons to believe that this was an insurgency that had nothing whatever to do with the pursuit of a liberal democratic order. One of them is that the insurgents are almost exclusively Sunni. So if this is a movement for democracy, why is it that religious minorities are not participating? So you won't find participation on the part of the Alawi community or the Christian community or the Druze community. So unless we expect that Druze and Alawis and Christians don't care about democracy, then this story doesn't make a lot of sense. Second, the Assad government made immediate concessions to the demonstrators. Immediate concessions. One of which was, if you look at the early demands of the demonstrators, they had two demands. One, suspend the security law. So the security law was an infringement of civil liberties that was invoked because, for a number of reasons, one of which is Syria is officially at war with Israel, which occupies Syrian territory in the Golan Heights. But Syria is in a very precarious security situation. It's oftentimes hard for people in the West to understand just how precarious their situation is, because we live in a very secure environment in which we face very few threats of any significance, although sometimes we think we face a significant Islamist threat. But look at Syria. It's faced for decades a significant internal threat from Islamists who have a very different idea about how to organize a society, that have been seeking to overthrow the government. It faces an external threat from Israel. It faces an external threat from the United States. It faces an external threat from the allies of Israel and the United States, of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey as well. Turkey has some aspirations. Turkey would like to see Syria as kind of a Muslim Brotherhood-led country which is subordinate to Turkey. So they find themselves in a very precarious security situation. So it's not surprising that they might limit civil liberties. But the Assad government immediately says, okay, we'll lift the security law. The second thing the Assad government says, because some people make some complaints about Syria, that, okay, so you have a multi-party legislature, that's fine. But you don't have multi-candidate presidential elections. Under the Syrian constitution of 1973, one party can nominate the president, and that was the Ba'ath Arab Socialist Party. And there were elections. The election is essentially a referendum. So the party puts forth their candidate, and the people say either yes, fine, or no, give us another candidate. So Assad says, we're going to amend the Constitution. We're going to abolish that part of the Constitution. Now, we're going to have multiple candidates. As long as you met some basic requirements, like you're a citizen of Syria and you're a certain age, etc. I mean, the kind of requirements you might have in the United States to run as president, you can run as president in Syria. So now you have, in Syria, a political system that more closely approximates the paradigm of multi-party representative democracy that we have in the West and that we favor in the West than do virtually every other Arab country. With the including all of the dictatorships that are the principal Arab allies of the United States. And I say dictatorships, most of them are monarchies, but they're absolute monarchies, so essentially they're royal dictatorships. These are the great allies of the United States. Saudi Arabia, probably the most repugnant society on the face of the planet. And that is the United States' principal ally in the Arab world. Contrast that with Syria now. Syria has a political system that's very close now to the one favored by countries in the West. So, despite that concession, the insurgency heats up. And the insurgents and the insurgent supporters of the United States, Britain and France say, that's not good enough. We don't care. We've made all of these concessions in the direction of democracy, so what? The insurgency actually heats up. Third thing I want to mention about this is Zbigniew Brzezinski, who had been Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, recently deceased. But he said about this, he said, quote, you know, we started helping the rebels, whoever they are, and they're certainly not fighting for democracy given their sponsorship of Qatar and Saudi Arabia, these horrible absolute monarchies. And he might have added they're certainly not fighting for democracy given that their main sponsor is the United States, which promotes not democracy as Condoleezza Rice acknowledged, but US business interests. I mean, economic interest, that is the primary goal. US economic interest. We don't care about democracy and human rights. So there's a Middle East specialist, his name was Patrick Seal. And he wrote about the Syrian uprising, that it should be viewed as only the latest, by far the most violent episode in the long war between Islamists and Ba'athists. And this dates back to the founding of the Ba'athist Party in the 1940s. In the 1940s, the Ba'athists and the Muslim Brotherhood used to have running battles on the streets of Damascus that were like the running battles that the Nazis and the communists used to have in Berlin, you know, where they're beating each other up and hitting each other over the head with clubs. In one of the battles, a man named Hafez al-Assad, who had become the president, was knifed by a Muslim brother. And that was the nature of the relationship between those two forces from the 1940s. It just continues to today. And so this isn't, you know, inspired by secular liberal democratic goals. It's inspired on the part of the insurgents by Islamist and sectarian goals, and on the part of the United States by the kinds of goals that Condoleezza Rice talked about, American economic interests. Also, the veteran foreign affairs correspondent Patrick Coburn had written not too long ago, you know, Washington has always wanted to get rid of Assad. We think about 2011 when Obama said Assad must step down because he's no longer legitimate and he has no support. That's when U.S. hostility to Syria began. It didn't begin then. It began from 2000 when Assad became president. And speaking of Assad's father, began when he was labeled an Arab communist. They've always wanted to get rid of the Assads for a long, long time. So I wanted to just mention, and of course this won't be news to you, that the standard operating procedure of U.S. campaigns of regime change is to reduce governments of Washington and wars to a single individual, and you know, who can be demonized as a Hitler or branded. They always say a brutal dictator. Why is it always brutal dictator? Presumably, maybe we should have benign dictators or something. I don't know. All dictators are always brutal, or an animal. That's what Trump called Assad. He's an animal, or a moral disgrace. That's what he was called by Noam Chomsky. But the enemy is not the individual. I mean, if Assad were to step down today and leave in his place a successor who also espoused that Arab socialist values, would the war end? Would the United States say, okay, that's fine, Assad stepped down, now we can all go home? Of course not. It wouldn't end. It wouldn't end for the Islamists because they don't care about Assad. What they care about is what he represents, that Arab socialist goals. It wouldn't matter to Washington because Washington only cares about what Assad represents, is that Arab socialist goals. If they're still in place, the war continues. You know, when the Ba'ath Arab socialist Saddam was driven from power in Iraq, Washington then installed its military dictator, which was L. Paul Bremer. And what was the first thing that Bremer did? He had order number 1 under the military administration of Iraq. Yeah, exactly. get rid of the Ba'athists, they called it the de-Ba'athification programs, and they drive all Ba'athist influence out of Iraq. Then they impose a constitution. If you read the constitution, it says Ba'athists can no longer participate in Iraqi politics. You can't run in an election if you're a Ba'athist. So we don't care if people elect you. You can't even run. And it also says, we know that you Ba'athists are going to try and sneak in by changing your name to something else. But we're scrutinizing everyone who steps forward to be a candidate in an election. And we'll find out who the Arab nationalists are, and we'll make sure you don't run. And so all kinds of people step forward when they have elections, and they're barred from running because they're identified as Arab nationalists. So the objective of Washington's long war in Iraq is not to get rid of Saddam. It was to de-Ba'athify the Iraqi state, to remove Arab nationalist influence from Iraq. Likewise, the objective of the long war in Syria is not to remove Assad, but to de-Ba'athify the Syrian state. So if Assad's government is ever toppled, and a U.S. puppet or a U.S. administrator is installed, order number one will be de-Ba'athification, the same thing, de-Ba'athification of the Syrian state. Now, I don't know if you've encountered these problems. Some people have who talk about Washington's long war in Syria and object to it. They're often accused of being supporters of the Assad government, denounced as apologists for dictatorship, or at best as questionable supporters of democracy. There's an Italian philosopher named Domenico Risordo, and he questions that view. So he says, you know, we're Democrats and we're really interested in democracy. We should be concerned about democracy on an international level, democratization of international relations. So he writes, you know, if a country declares and decides that it has the right to provoke a war without the authorization of the Security Council, that country is developing a theory. And the theory is that the United States, that country, has the right to exercise despotism over the rest of humanity, a tyranny over all of humanity. It's open despotism. The United States and the West, he says, declare openly that they have a right to intervene in every corner of the world. And when you declare that right, you're declaring that you're a despot, that you're a tyrant, that you are exercising an international dictatorship. So, you know, he goes on to argue, as Patrick Coburn has, that Washington has always wanted to get rid of Assad long before 2011. He says, you know, they say they should carry out a change of regime in Syria because Assad is against Israel and he's against the West. But that, once you say that, that's despotism. And those who struggle against such despots are the real defenders of democracy. So let me just end by mentioning that, so a year after Muammar Gaddafi, we'll go to Muammar Gaddafi. I said I was going to say something about Libya. Muammar Gaddafi was inspired by the same goals as the Ba'ath Arab Socialist. He wasn't a Ba'ath Arab Socialist. He was an Arab nationalist initially. He admired the principle of Arab nationalists, which was Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt. He wanted to be Nasser's lieutenant. When he came to power, that is Gaddafi, in a coup in Libya, first thing he wanted to do is to turn over Libya to Egypt, to be run by Nasser. Nasser was his great hero. But he wrote a constitution for Libya, and in the constitution are explicit references to the Ba'ath Arab Socialist Party's motto: unity, freedom, and socialism. So a year after Gaddafi, who was inspired by these goals, you know, unity, freedom, and socialism, was removed from power by Islamists, backed by NATO. We heard about there was an uprising in Libya. The uprising was by Islamists. That's not what we were led to understand at the time. And they were backed by NATO. And I have to say this as a Canadian fighter pilots participated in that campaign. And Canadian fighter pilots said, you know what, we're and they thought this was a big joke. It's not very funny. We're Al-Qaeda's Air Force. That's what they said. They quipped that, but they knew they were. And how did they know they were? We know this because there was a reporter in Canada who filed an access to information request to Canadian military intelligence. And he got Canadian military intelligence reports, which were being sent to the Prime Minister of Canada saying, you know who's rising up against Gaddafi? It's Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda connected Islamists. That's who's carrying out the uprising. And Canadian pilots are participating in that effort to oust Gaddafi. And so when they quipped that they were Gaddafi's Air Force, they weren't quipping, they were telling the truth. Al-Qaeda's Air Force, yeah. Sorry. But anyway, so a year after this happened, Wall Street Journal, you probably have inferred by now that I read the Wall Street Journal. The Wall Street Journal reveals that oil companies were agitating for Gaddafi's removal. Why? Because he was crazy and he wore funny uniforms and he lived in a tent or something in Central Park when he visited New York? No. Why? Because he was driving hard bargains with the oil companies and insisting, this is their complaint, he was insisting that Libyans benefit from their own oil resources. Well, why would they complain about that? Well, you know, U.S. oil companies believe, not only U.S. oil companies, Western oil companies, private oil companies believe that the petroleum resources of the Arab and Muslim world should be used for the enrichment of their shareholders, not for the enrichment of Libyans. They don't care about Libyans. But, you know, oil company executives are systemically and legally bound to hold this view. You won't be an oil company executive very long if you think that the interests of Libyans are superior to those of your shareholders. Gaddafi had the very opposite view. And he thought that the interests of Libyans were superior to those of U.S. oil company shareholders. And as a consequence, he had to go. Or the State Department arranged for him to be eliminated. For his part, Assad has very similar views. Here's what Assad said. Syria is an independent state working for the interests of the people, rather than making the Syrian people work for the interests of the United States. That's not a view that corporate America is going to like very much, or even the State Department. So, a day before my book went to press, I was reading an essay. Just as a matter, I didn't plan to do this, this was just a serendipity. I was reading an essay by a man who's named Norman Bethune. And here's my additional Canadian reference. Norman Bethune is a notable Canadian. He's not well known in Canada, he's well known in China. And who he was a skilled and an innovative surgeon. He was at the forefront of the fight for public health care in Canada. He's not known in Canada for that. But he's mainly known for participating in two wars in the late 1930s. And one was the Spanish Civil War, and the second was the Second Sino-Japanese War. And in the Second Sino-Japanese War, Bethune joined Mao's forces as a frontline surgeon in the resistance against the Japanese effort to colonize China. And he's revered in China. But it was in China that Bethune wrote an essay. He wrote this essay, it's called Wounds. And the essay was this meditation on the causes of the war he was entangled. So Mao's forces were fighting against the Japanese. And Bethune was talking about the war that produced the wounds that he was called upon every day to operate on. So ultimately saying, I operate on these wounds, I operate on the wounds of soldiers. The wounds were created by the war. What creates the war? Because what creates the war is ultimately what creates these wounds I have to deal with every day. And as I read the essay, it struck me that what Bethune was saying in his essay was said in very few words what I was trying in the whole book to say. So I quickly asked my publisher if he'd include a quote from Wounds as the epigraph of the book. So let me just read you the epigraph. So he wrote, "Are wars of aggressions, wars for the conquest of colonies, just big business?" Yes, it would seem so. However much the perpetrators of such national crimes seek to hide their true purpose under banners of high-sounding abstractions and ideals. My reference to colonies maybe might throw you off in suggesting that Washington's long war in Syria is an attempt to create a colony in Syria of the United States, because we wouldn't think of the United States trying to establish a colony. Interestingly, there's an article in the New York Times today by Tim Arango about Iraq, and the astonishing thing is said in there, which is the United States intends to maintain a military presence in Iraq after ISIS is eliminated in order to contain Iran. So if the United States can essentially determine that it will continue, it will maintain troops within Iraq on a permanent basis without regard to any of the aspirations or interests of Iraqis, then is effectively made as a colony in Iraq. So anyway, these high-sounding abstractions and ideals are expressed today, in the claims that the United States has a moral obligation to act in Syria, or the West has a responsibility to protect civilians from their own governments, and that we cannot stand idly by. Well, the most insightful part of Bethune's essay was his last paragraph. So let me just tell you what he wrote in his last paragraph. He said, the enemies of the human race, these enemies of the human race he's referring to, and these are the people who are in the hunt for profit, start to wars, and create the wounds he's called upon to heal. Do they wear on their foreheads a sign that they may be told, and shunned and condemned? No. On the contrary, they are the respectable ones. They are honored, they call themselves, and they're called gentlemen. They're the pillars of the state, of the church, and society. They support public and private charity out of the excess of their wealth. They endow institutions. In their private lives, they're usually kind and considerate and amiable. But there's one sign by which these gentlemen can be told. Threaten a reduction in their profits, and the beast in them awakens with a snarl. They become ruthless as savages, brutal as madmen, remorseless as executioners. And when you read in the Wall Street Journal, that Western oil companies had complained to the U.S. State Department that something had to be done about Gaddafi because he threatened a reduction in their profits. Well, it's hard not to think of the pillars of society and the respectable people of whom Bethune wrote. So Bethune ends his essay with this. Such an organization as permits these enemies of humanity to exist must be abolished. And the overarching theme of my book, The Long War on, or Washington's Long War in Syria, is that that war can only be understood within the context of an organization of society as permits these enemies of humanity to exist. So, thank you for bearing with me. Thank you for sitting through that.
Questions and discussion folks would like. And the book, Washington's Long War, is over here. Bauman ordered 50 copies. They sent him 43. And everyone except for the 10 here have been sold in the last 2 meetings. So we'll pick up the book at the end. I'm sure Stephen will sign. Stephen, how much is the book?
I believe Bauman's selling it for $20, $5 off the publisher's price.
$20.
Very good.
So questions, discussions, people have?
Let's see.
I just let
Yeah, he's got $20.
I want to renew the question I asked you before. Was the use made, I would say roughly 8 years ago, by the U.S. government at the behest of the Canadian government, Assad services by rendering a Canadian citizen to be tortured and asked questions, interrogated in Syria, how does that jive with this almost 40-year-long history of a war against the fascist regime?
Yeah, which is a great question, and usually I only get that question in Canada because Mara Arar, being a Canadian, is well known in Canada. I don't recall all of the details, but Mara Arar was in the United States coming from another country and was stopped in the United States in transit to Canada, and the Canadian security officials sent information to U.S. authorities saying that Arar was a member of the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria. He had been a Syrian who had become a Canadian citizen. And so he was rendered and sent to Syria, where he was tortured, or at least that's the claim. I'm not disputing the claim. He likely was tortured. Well, I don't know if he was tortured, but anyway, it was said he was tortured. And he says he was tortured. And so many people will say to me, how is it that Syria, or you can present Syria as being anti-imperialist or at odds with the United States, if it cooperated with the United States in this rendering, and it did cooperate in the rendering program. And you said, how does this jive with the decades-long war against the Islamists? Well, that's precisely it. It does jive. So I don't know this for sure, I'm just speculating, but I would suspect from Damascus' perspective, they said, okay, the United States is hostile to us. What can we do to diminish that hostility? Because that makes our life a lot easier. What can we do to diminish that hostility without actually compromising on our political objectives? Well, one of the things we can do is cooperate with them on the elimination of Islamists or the containment of Islamists, the containment of Al-Qaeda. And this will be to our benefit because Al-Qaeda Islamist or political Islam, violent Sunni political Islam, is a threat, an internal threat. And if they believe that Arar was a Muslim brother from Syria, they believed him to be a threat. So they probably reasoned, okay, so this is to our benefit. We get brownie points with the United States, and we get to deal with our internal Islamist problem. You know, something, to be fair, that I should mention about the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is a much more moderate organization within many parts of the Arab world, where it participates in elections. One of the reasons it's a violent organization in Syria is because it's foreclosed from the option of participating in elections. And the reason why is because the Syrian constitution forbids certain kinds of political parties. It forbids certain kinds of political parties because, as I mentioned, Hafez al-Assad had a mission for the Syrian state. The mission was to bring the Arab world together. So if you want to bring the Arab world together, by their reasoning, you don't emphasize cleavages within Arab society. So you don't allow people to establish parties based on religious affiliation, because that's simply a way of creating divisions within Arab society. So the Muslim Brothers can't exist as a political party in Syria. They have no other option if they want to achieve political change than to take up arms. By the way, parties based on class are also forbidden in Syria. You can't have a workers' party in Syria, for example. Because what is the major or the primary form of identification is supposed to be with the Arab nation. Because it's a national, I mean, the project for, at least Hafez al-Assad's project was the project of Arab nationalism.
I have a question.
Oh, just, I think Bob had a question.
Just in continuation, wasn't the Muslim Brotherhood violent in Egypt too? Didn't they assassinate President Sadat?
Yeah.
It was after that when they were really attacked by the Egyptian government, that they decided that they wanted to decide on violence and the conflict.
Yes.
wasn't it?
Yeah, and who knows, ultimately, maybe that might happen in Syria. Maybe it may be the case that someone down the road says, okay, we're going to allow the Muslimhood to contest elections and participate in elections in the way in which it does in other Arab countries.
So, Syria has been a big point of contention for the left and peace movement in the United States. I believe a lot of that has to do with propaganda we get around Assad and so forth. But there's a couple of things, and we just raised a couple of things, maybe we could just comment on each of them. First of all, the question of the Palestinians and the Palestinian refugees that are in camps and communities in Syria. I know the Palestinians were at least divided over what's happening there. But basically, a number of folks thought that the Palestinians are opposed to Assad and supported whatever rebellion was there. Secondly, I've heard, we all heard in the news, but we stopped hearing in the news, that people from other countries, they used to say 80 some other countries, were entering Syria to fight against Assad. You don't hear that so much. They used to actually say how many came from the United States and how many came from Britain and how many came from Chechnya and how many came from other places. You don't hear that so much anymore. Is there a reason for that, and has that stopped? And the third thing you hear from the left is that not so much a civil war, which is a term that is used a lot in the U.S. media, but that there was a revolutionary upsurge against Assad. They don't say that too much anymore, but can you comment on those three aspects?
You're going to have to help me remember them all.
The first one was it's Palestinian issue. The second was the people coming internally, externally into the country to fight. Are they still there, and how many are there, and so forth. And the third was just this question of, was there ever a revolutionary upsurge from the left that was opposed to Assad in that country?
Okay. Well, I'll answer another question that you didn't ask first.
Okay.
Because you said something that suggested it to me. You said what you mainly hear about is Assad as the dictator, the brutal dictator who uses barrel bombs. I just wanted to mention about that. So why do we hear about the brutal dictator, and that's all we hear? And one of the things I wanted to address in my book was the ideology that animates the bad era socialists. And one of the reasons I did that is because you'll notice that no one ever talks about it. No one. If you read in the press or follow the media, no one would ever tell you that he's an Arab nationalist, or what Arab nationalist is, or what his government is trying to accomplish. And why not? And I think the reason they don't is because his goals probably resonate with people. I mean, people, you, me, others would say, yeah, this is completely reasonable. He wants sovereignty. That's what they want. There's nothing wrong with that. And yet, so the only way in which you can justify an attack or an intervention is to paint him as some kind of demon. It's the United States as the cavalry coming to the rescue against the bad guy again. So, bringing us to the Palestinians, and you're mentioning the Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, one of the major organizations of Palestinian, or the major organizations of the national liberation movement in Palestine, the Palestinian national liberation would be Hamas. Hamas is connected to the Muslim Brotherhood. Hamas, therefore, has identified with the Islamist uprising against Syria, because it's a Muslim Brotherhood-led uprising, despite the fact that the Syrian government was one of the major supporters of Hamas. Hamas leaders were based in Damascus. receiving subsidies from Damascus. They're no longer in Damascus, now they're in Qatar. So there's been a falling out there. And as a result of that falling out, Iran was providing money to Hamas. Even though Iran is Shia, or the government is Shia, and Iran is a Shia dominant country, providing money to Hamas, Muslim Brotherhood, which is Sunni. They stopped providing money to Hamas. And they started sending money to the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which is a Marxist group, in place of Hamas. So I'm not sure if that answers your question about the Palestinians, but if there is an opposition to the government of Damascus among Palestinians, I suspect it's related to identification with Hamas. And then the second question was the...
People coming externally, they used to say 80 countries, but I haven't heard any discussion of that anymore. Are they still part of the opposition? Where is that?
I think they're still recruited into ISIS. Still have been recruited into Al-Qaeda, which is sometimes often called Al-Nusra. I call it Al-Qaeda, since Al-Nusra is simply Al-Qaeda's branch in Syria, which also turns out to be the largest Al-Qaeda branch in the world. A lot of internationalists, if you want to put it that way, have now become not Islamists, but Western leftists going to join the YPG, which is the Kurdish group operating in northern Syria. And the reports of these people who are inspired by the YPG, young men from Canada and the United States and Europe, going to fight with the Kurdish guerrillas against ISIS. That has become an interesting story as well. They call themselves the YPG. I call them PKK, which is the PKK as the Kurdish, used to be called Marxist guerrilla group. But it turns out that the leader of that group had been inspired by the anarchist writings of Murray Bookchin. And it's more like an anarchist group, which operates in Syria as the YPG, they call themselves. And it's become important because the United States in its fight against ISIS right now, and also Washington's relationship to ISIS is very interesting, but I'll skip over that for the moment. But now, with the fight against ISIS, who's being used as a surrogate for U.S. boots on the ground? The United States doesn't want to deploy tens of thousands of soldiers to Syria, so they're using the YPG, or the PKK, these Kurdish forces, to essentially recover territory that's currently held by ISIS, but they have no intention of giving it back to the Syrian government. The intention is to hold that territory. It's not that Washington will hold the territory directly, but will hold the territory through its proxy, which has become the PKK in northern Syria. And some people from the West, Western leftists, have gone to join this group. Unfortunately, they're deluded and misguided. It's interesting that they go and join the PKK in the context of Syria, but they didn't go to join the PKK in the context of the PKK's fight against the Turkish government, which is where the main battle lies for the Kurdish nationalist movement. But they were inspired by these ideas that these are people with these beautiful communist views who are going to establish a leftist paradise in northern Syria, not seeming to recognize that this is a nationalist movement that's actually now acting as I think the New York Times put it, the spear of the United States. The spear of the United States because the United States doesn't want to commit its own troops on the ground, except for the ones that are advising these people. I mean, there are hundreds now of advisors. There are U.S. Marines, there's Army Rangers, there are Special Forces. And then the third...
Was there ever a revolutionary leftist upsurge that some leftists always have looked to as what was really going on there? I haven't heard that discussed very much lately either, but there are some groups, I could name the groups, that's what they saw. I mean, they saw some internet posting somewhere, in my opinion, and they claim that was really the main feature of the universities and so forth in Syria that was opposing.
Right. And I heard it, yeah, I know, and I saw this, and I thought, this is weird, because I don't know anything about these groups, and where did they come from? And so I started checking, and doing, where is any evidence of this? Where is the evidence? I want to see the evidence, because if they're there, I'm interested in finding out about them. And I found absolutely not a speck of evidence anywhere that any of these groups existed. There are some, you know, groups that sounded nice, like the FSA, first, the Free Syrian Army, you might have heard of. If you did any investigation of the Free Syrian Army, you found, if you looked at, you know, one of the things I was interested in, what are their goals? What's their platform? If you investigate, you'll find out that the Free Syrian Army had one goal, has one goal: eliminate Assad. That's it. So that's the goal: eliminate Assad. So, and then replace Assad with what? And if you read some of the early writing that Time and Newsweek and others were doing, or the New York Times were doing on the FSA, they described the FSA as essentially a loose collection of mainly Islamist groups, presented later as a secular group, but it wasn't as secular, it was Islamist. But I've had people in talks claim, well, you say they're all Islamists, the opposition, but surely there were some secularists in there, some revolutionaries. Well, okay, so who were they though? And no one ever has an answer. So this is a claim that seems to be based on absolutely no evidence. Even more like wishful thinking.
Questions, discussion?
I just wanted to ask you, what other books have you written? What else have you written about? You've done such a great job in Syria.
I'm writing one now that will be released in the spring of 2018 on North Korea.
Oh, I hope you do.
Thank you, Steve, for coming up.
Thank you for having me.